Hi, I'm Tom Zimmerman from the EMDR podcast. This episode is all about your clients, and you probably have plenty of them at a time if you work in community mental health, who basically say, this doesn't work for me. Whatever resource you're trying to get them to do doesn't work for me. Breathing doesn't work for me. Calm scene doesn't work for me. In these cases, I think it is the obligation of the therapist to try to figure out how to teach it differently. Because I think a lot of the problems that we're going to explore really have not just to do with clients and their nervous systems, but they have to do with us and our comfort in teaching these things and our comfort in understanding the nervous systems that we're working with. Because many clients with complex trauma are going to come to us pretty convinced that they've already failed mindfulness, and they're pretty sure that they're about to fail EMDR. And EMDR may be their last-ditch effort towards survival. I don't even know if we want to use the word hope. Some approaches that are out there related to teaching mindfulness to clients assume that we're working with a non-pervasively traumatized nervous system. They just do. Because if you knew the nervous system that you were working with, you wouldn't be approaching clients in this way. And we don't want to assume, we don't want our default stance to be that we're working with someone without a lot of trauma, if we are trauma therapists. Many approaches tend to throw the client into the deep end of the present, into the deep end of the body, or into the deep end of noticing without adequate preparation or guidance, almost as though they're running every client through the same mindfulness machine. And that's not what we want to do. So how we approach a client with a severely traumatized nervous system needs to be different than how we approach a system that's relatively healthy. And our interventions obviously should match the client that we're working with. So again, maybe the problem isn't that many of our clients simply can't do mindfulness. Maybe the problem is that we don't have very sophisticated or nuanced ways of teaching it to clients who have diverse nervous systems. What we do know is that complex trauma is not a special case. Um, it's nearly the only case that many of us in community mental health contexts globally will see or treat. A large percentage of pervasively traumatized clients will struggle with even the most basic forms of mindfulness for reasons that we'll explore, but also because of how we teach it. And in that dynamic, the easiest thing to change in that equation is how we teach it. So even in EMDR therapy, the assumption very often that happens, I can just imagine new trainees, kind of flipping through their manuals going, okay, now we're in phase 2, and I'm going to teach you these resources so that you can calm down when you get activated. And while this is true, I'm hoping what you're going to hear is the therapist agenda, even in the way we may be introducing it. So, and as you will see, when working with clients with extreme trauma, really what we're looking for in these early kind of dip your toe in exposures, what we're looking for is information about the client's nervous system and not necessarily a big relaxation response. And I want to show you a large part of this EMDR podcast, a large part of EMDR's third weekend is about showing you how we can use the information that we get that surfaces up out of these things that kind of feel like failures, how we can use this information in the service of the client's recovery. It is important to realize that what we're asking the clients to do with many mindful activities may feel like it's going against some pretty common or core survival strategies that have been essential in them managing and carrying the large traumatic load that they are carrying. So related to what might go wrong, let's think about how many clients with complex trauma are currently surviving. Many clients with complex trauma have a problematic relationship with the present. And mindfulness, a lot of it is about the present. Many clients have survived by staying ahead of it, whatever it is, And slowing down makes them more nervous, right? Because the present is where everything bad happens. And many clients with complex trauma live in an aggregated mashup of the past and the future, kind of bad versions of the past and the future, neither of which are okay. In fact, they're pretty horrible, which lets you know how horrible that the present must feel if that's what they do to avoid it. So things catching up, however bad, living in these kind of aggregated pasts and aggregated presents are, the idea of things catching up in the present are much, much worse, which is why many of your clients, boredom may cause things to seep. And tripping, and many, many, many clients that we see for the first time have been staying ahead all of their lives of all this trauma. Something happens that trips them, that slows them down, and then everything they've ever pushed aside shows up all at once. Not just the thing that tripped them, but the presenting issue in a lot of ways can be absolutely everything. A lot of mindfulness also is about exploring the experience of the body in the present. The body also is where everything bad happened. As important, the body is where very little good happens, including positive affect. This is designed by the client and by the client's parts on purpose. Again, hope is something I used to do. Okay? Bodies are temples buried and abandoned long ago, and a large chunk of dissociation is often of the somatic or the body-based kind. Approaching the body is a lot like approaching a Korean demilitarized zone. You really have to watch where you step and how you move. And we want to explore more about that in this episode and in almost everything we explore or talk about on the EMDR podcast and on EMDR's Third Weekend. Noticing is also a problem for many, many clients with complex trauma, and it's not just clients with complex trauma. We live in pervasively dissociated cultures. So once we come to see dissociation, we often will see it everywhere. And to me, it often seems like the whole point of Western civilization is to pervasively distract ourselves from ourselves. So culturally, we do almost anything not to notice and be present with our stuff. And how much of addictions are to numb our noticing. And once we learn how not to notice, once you kind of make that turn, which for me is very, very familiar in my own life and in my own story. Again, once we learn how to not notice, there's almost nothing we can't endure. There's almost nothing we won't or can't put up with. Often what gets clients with severe trauma to have a strong motivation to change is that very thing that tripped them. A health issue, a work issue, a relationship issue, a death. And these things make it impossible or really, really difficult for them to have the same disconnected relationship with the present, with their bodies. And things are simply happening in ways that are much above their capacity to ignore. So a lot of times when we first meet a client with complex trauma, we're not just meeting someone who's carried a lot of stuff, but very often we're meeting someone for whom their survival strategies and their survival mechanisms are no longer working the way they had been working. Long story short, they're struggling to stay ahead of it. So as we start to think about how to introduce mindful task in a different way to clients, we also want to realize that a lot of what we're giving them is information. And we want to understand the context in which this information may be received. So think about your average client with complex trauma. How hard are their minds running when you're first having contact with them? So the minds of many of our clients are running like jet engines. To be more specific, parts of clients are very active and maybe in pretty active conflict with other parts of the self over what to do, what sense to make of, and how to best manage the current catastrophe. Imagine a therapist entering into this, jet engine conflict dynamic, asking the client to slow down and notice, sometimes for long periods of time, when the mind is at war with itself. Or imagine the mind running like a jet engine, and then you ask the client to build a calm scene of a beach. Imagine, in that context, the difficulty of making the sand, the sky, clouds, sunshine, birds, ocean, wave, buildings, all of the sensory components of that, when internally the nervous system feels like it's in the battle of the bulge. And all these creative tasks are hard to create and tolerate when we are in fight, flight, or freeze. And add to all of these things the performance anxiety of trying a skill focused on these places of discomfort, again, the present, the body, and knowing that the therapist is going to ask them about their experience with it. So while they're doing this skill, they know, oh my gosh, Tom's going to ask me in a minute what I'm getting or what I'm noticing or what my experience, or even worse, he's going to ask me how much is this calming me down. These are clients that are accustomed to being what other people need them to be. And performance anxiety associated with, is this working? Am I doing this right? What does it mean that I don't find this relaxing? All of these things may be one of the dozens and dozens of things that are going through their mind when we're asking them to calm down, or when we're asking them to do these resources and with the hopes of them calming down. So what I want to do in the next parts of this is I want to talk about one way to do this differently. And again, there are lots and lots of ways to do this differently. This is one way. And I want to split it across 7 pretty easy basic steps. Modify this as you need. There is nothing sacred here. This is just how I tend to work, and it tends to work okay. So the first thing we want to do, if we're working differently and introducing mindfulness differently, when we feel like the client may have been run through the same mindfulness machine using the same, you know, interventions where they may have been thrown into the deep end too soon without modifications based on the complexity of their nervous system. The first step is we want to normalize the difficulty of doing all the things we're asking them to do, and normalize the way that these things we're asking them to do may challenge the client's survival strategies. Okay? So we wanna just simply acknowledge the difficulty, right? So what that may sound like is, of course, mindfulness, the way we've been approaching it isn't working well for you. And invite the client, would you be interested if we were to try this in a different way? Is that something that may be okay? So step 1 really is to just normalize the difficulties, because the clients are used to being on the receiving end of the implication, oh, you're breathing slowly and this isn't calming you down. I don't know what to do with you. You're not making sense to me. So the other thing we want to do, related to the parts and related to the jet engine of the head, is we want to appreciate the role of parts. And as important as appreciating the role of parts, we want to engage those parts and get consent to do everything we do. So if you're working with a system, and by the way, you're always working with a system, get consent from all parts of the system to engage in mindfulness exercises, and explain clearly what you're doing differently this time that didn't work in the previous times. So the reason we do this is part of the difficulty in mindful task is that when parts don't have the opportunity to consent or express concerns, they may communicate their concerns in ways that they are likely to be heard, and in ways that we used to call resistance before we were trauma focused, and have kind of removed resistance from our vocabulary. So this is what one example of asking clients for consent might look like. It's as simple as this. I'd like to teach you a way to notice breathing that doesn't involve taking really deep or slow breaths, and it doesn't involve noticing the breath in an internal way at all. Is that something we can try? Does any part of you think that's a bad idea? And if we engage the system and there are concerns, we want to normalize those. We want to explain what our motivation is in doing this differently. And then we're going to reevaluate if that normalization has resolved the concern that part is brought, that part is brought. If it hasn't, we move on for now because that part needs to be heard when it says no. Okay, so that's an important kind of trauma-focused intervention. When any part says, I don't think this is a good idea, we need to send the signal, particularly early on, that we hear it and that we respect that decision. So one of the most important things we can do, and this is the third step of doing things differently, is if a lot of what's triggering and has been triggering about mindful stuff is that we've been dumping people into the deep end too soon, you really want to dip your toe in. And almost everything on the EMDR podcast, almost everything on EMDR's third weekend is governed by the dip your toe in approach. And the way you dip your toe in first, the most fundamental way of dipping your toe in using a mindful strategy is by decreasing the time that the client is exposed to the resource. We want to dramatically shorten that time. So one of the things that's most triggering for clients that have an enormous amount of trauma is when they get thrown into the deep end of the present, this moment, the deep end of the body, or the deep end of noticing without any clear instruction about what they're supposed to do or when this exercise will end. And I know early on, and as a therapist, that was something that would just make my parts, to be honest, get very, very angry when someone wouldn't tell me how long we're doing this mindful resource, or they would tell me we're going to do this for about 15 minutes. 15 minutes to my part sounded like an eternity. So it's very important if you're having them sit somewhere that's uncomfortable. So it's very important to communicate a task and to communicate that each component or each part that we're asking them to do is only going to last a moment. And it's important that we don't just communicate that the exercise will be brief. We want to actually guide the client through it very, very briefly. So again, don't tell them it's going to be brief and then walk them through a moderate or a very long, resource that involves an enormous amount of talking. Let them know that it's going to be brief and actually make it brief, with each component only lasting a few seconds. So again, this is very, very helpful in engaging parts because they may get behind the idea that all we're going to do is dip our toe in and we're looking for information. We're not looking for you to calm all the way down or relax all the way down. Again, all we're looking for is information. We're going to be very brief. This will be over before you know it. And that is one way to start this process. The fourth step in doing this different is that we want to normalize the idea that we're not necessarily looking for the client to calm down dramatically. So when we're working with clients with complex trauma, I'm not necessarily looking for a resource to be directly and immediately calming. It's okay if it's neutral. And let me explain why. Many clients say that mindfulness resources make their stress and distress worse. So what that means is I'm happy if we can find a way to do a breath or to do noticing distress or noticing pleasure or observing the body or observing this moment for just a second without anything getting worse. Because if we can do that, right, if we can put our toe somewhere that is neutral or doesn't make things worse, we can put two toes there next session. And before long, we'll have somewhere for the client to stand. And what we're doing here in this step is we're looking to create disconfirming information that is built into the expectations clients have related to these exercises. So the client is expecting something to happen, and then we're doing this exercise in a way that's different than and hopefully is inducing an experience different than what they're expecting, and then we leverage that new learning. These are some examples of that disconfirming learning. I can slow down and a catastrophe doesn't happen. I can notice aspects of the internal experience of my body briefly and a catastrophe doesn't happen. I can imagine very briefly my younger self getting a hug from an attachment figure and a catastrophe doesn't happen. Do you see? In each of those, we're not asking about calming, relaxation at all. What we're doing is we're creating first a disconfirming experience of an expectation that when these things happen, it gets worse. So for complex clients with very high anxiety, we also don't want them to do something that relaxes them a lot quickly. And again, this comes from the awareness that their baseline anxiety is likely a function of the current dysfunction of their parts. And it exists, this baseline anxiety exists with the intention of keeping the client safe. So if this baseline anxiety is how the client's parts are keeping them safe, if they relax too much, and again, if they relax too much, particularly when they didn't give consent to do the exercises, say for instance, they go from an 8.5 out of 10 stress to a 5.5 out of 10 stress in just a few moments, that's way too deep of a dive, and many clients with complex trauma may have a counter reaction, and it may push them right back up above their window of tolerance near outside of their window of tolerance, above their baseline and near panic. Again, the very high anxiety that clients feel when we first meet clients is their nervous system attempting to keep them safe. And we need to introduce disconfirming information slowly, spread out, and in ways that the system finds tolerable. Okay. Step 5. In this, just again, one way of doing this differently. I think it is important to recalibrate what working for me means. Okay? Because when clients tell you, X exercise, it doesn't work for me, there's information in it. So part of what is difficult with mindfulness with many clients who've been in therapy for many years may be how prior therapists have taught it and the agenda that they bring to it. Again, what I'm looking for when I'm first approaching a client's system is information. And whatever we get, whatever happens, it's just information. And we want to use that information to inform what's going to come next in the service of the client's recovery. So part of what we need to do is redefine what working for me means when we're working with someone who's hypervigilant and on the edge of panic almost all of the time. Few people, including few of us, have the ability to go from an 8 out of 10 level of stress to relax. We just don't. What they may be able to do is briefly tap the brake and go from an 8 to a 7 in some place in their body, and then after a few moments, they're going to go right back up to the 8 level. And what we need to normalize is that's what it means. That's what working for you means when we're working with a client with severe trauma-related stress. And we need to recalibrate that as success. This is success, right? This is success. And to give an example to why when a client tells you that this is not, right, this is not working for me, if I have a headache and you give me an aspirin and it only helps for 15 seconds, I'm going to say with an absolutely straight face that aspirin didn't work for me. But when we're approaching a client with a pervasively traumatized nervous system, this is what working for me means, and we need to normalize that. So if something calms you at all, it may calm you a little bit in a certain part of your body, and then after a few moments, it may go right back up. That is what working for you means when we first approach a client with really severe trauma, particularly of the hypervigilant type. To demonstrate the differences between a traumatized and a non-traumatized nervous system, I want to use the metaphor of cars, two different cars. Let's imagine one car is a regular car going down the highway and it's coasting at 45 miles an hour. What happens when you tap the brake? What happens when you tap the brake in a normal car going 45 miles an hour is that the car slows down. It often will slow down dramatically until something happens that pushes the brake again and speeds it back up. So this is what a non-pervasively traumatized nervous system looks like. And you do mindfulness with this nervous system. We tap the brake, it calms them down, and they stay calm until something comes along and pushes their gas pedal and gets them back activated again. The other car is the version of the car with a pervasively traumatized nervous system. And this car has a cinder block on the gas pedal all of the time. And it's going at about 95 miles an hour. What happens in this car when we tap the brake? If it slows at all, it slows down a little bit, but as soon as you take your foot off the brake, it returns to 95 miles per hour. And we need to normalize that this is normal and that the problem is the cinder block changing what normal looks like and how normal functions. And we need to identify with a client that this is what working for me means. And we need to teach clients how to tap the brake despite it not working deeply and immediately. We need to teach them how to tap the brake at all and ask them to observe that a catastrophe didn't happen. Okay, so even if you tap the brake and it doesn't calm you down much, but it doesn't get worse, then a catastrophe didn't happen. And if we do tap the brake, even briefly, and anxiety does get worse, then we need to normalize how hard your parts are working to keep you safe. And then we're going to circle around next time. And even that light tap that we did, we're going to do an even lighter tap. But we do need to normalize the important work that your parts are doing to try to keep you safe right now. And if our parts don't trust tapping the brake, then we need to engage those parts when we touch the brake even lighter next time and for even less time. So again, when resources are triggering, we're putting them in the deep end of the pool too quickly. One of the strategies for managing that are to dip your toe in and dip your toe in for even less time. Step 6 of one way to do this differently is one of my favorite things, and I'm not going to talk about them in great detail here because they're all over the rest of the podcast. They're bridge resources. So what happens? Again, EMDR resourcing with clients with complex trauma, phase 2 is one of the most difficult, challenging parts. And many of your clients are going to jump, but they're not quite going to make it. They're going to jump, and then it's not going to work. When that happens, we need to build bridges. And what I call these are bridge resources. So once we understand, again, and the point is, if a client struggles with a resource, you didn't do anything wrong. It's an opportunity to get information and understand the client system a little bit better. And it can become clearer about how and where their system's protecting them and how we can start to construct bridges. So when clients attempt resources, but they don't make it to the other side, we're going to build a bridge. Bridge resources are introduced, like I say, all over the podcast. So look for things like blue smoke breathing and hand breathing. These exercises externalize the breath. Also, dip your toe in body scan is another way to do a very quick body scan. Dip your toe in sensory grounding is another one. All of these ways to externalize noticing or to engage in resourcing in ways that are different or shorter than typical approaches. So when clients struggle to visualize, this is super important. I have a feeling that 1 million clients that have needed to do EMDR haven't done EMDR because they've struggled with visualization. So when clients struggle to visualize, we need to build bridges. So look for the episodes in the podcast that show you how to outsource the calm scene or the attachment figure or the container to a video. And once clients have these bridge resources, we can put a foot there. We can leverage that. Once we have a place for a toe, we can put 2 toes. We can put 3 toes. We can put some weight on our foot there. So when they can breathe deeper with that footing or explore the calm scene using all of the senses or dip their toe into the present a little bit more fully, they can do it from this place of new footing. Okay? So good. Step 7 of one way to do this differently, and I cannot stress the importance of this. Another is send your clients home to practice these resources at their baseline, not when they've just been triggered. So another missed opportunity in how we typically teach mindfulness is we teach these very tentative and what I may even say is flimsy at first resources in session. And then we send clients home to practice them only when they're absolutely losing their minds. And if I gave you key lime pie to eat every time you were on the edge of panic, how long would it take before the smell of key lime pie gets paired with panic? And simply that will induce panic. Again, what we're looking for is disconfirming information. Leveraging that disconfirming information is how we're going to get clients to start to lower their baseline. So again, tap the brake, nothing bad happens. Tap the brake, nothing bad happens. Tap the brake, notice that it may calm you a little bit and nothing bad happened. So we're dipping our toes into lower distress, and the client is learning that this lower distress can also feel safe and create the possibility of the client's parts relaxing or at least seeing some advantaging in trying. And if we only do this, if the only time we're dipping our toe in, again, the whole point of dipping our toe in is to get to the layers below. If the only time we're doing this is when the client has just been triggered, we're not dipping into the layers below. So long story short, let the nervous system realize that tapping the brake can be safe. Let it learn that this is one of the things that we do when we're calming down on purpose at our baseline, right? Rather than only doing this when we're losing our minds. So again, do this. Send them home to practice this at their baseline. And if you do, within a few weeks, it may be really, really available when you do need it. So it may be able to let the client do this once the client realizes that it's a good idea. So let's put all of this together, okay? All of this is one way. And again, it's just one way to put all of this together. And we start by normalizing how absolutely sensible your system is in acting in these ways to keep you stressed out all of the time, because it does not know that you've survived what you've survived. It does not know that what's over is over. So it's a good idea to ask permission of the system to try something different and briefly dip your toe into the disconfirming information of that. Normalize that we're not necessarily looking for something to dramatically calm you right now, right out of the gate, and recalibrate what a resource working for you means given the current state of your system, given the current state of your nervous system. When clients jump but don't make it, construct bridges, okay? Construct bridges so that they can practice these resources at their baseline until your system can identify them as safe. Until the system knows that the resource is something that you do to calm down and can identify it as safe, you do not want to be practicing it when you're losing your mind. So, and while there are a lot of other ways to do the same types of things, what we don't want to do, big thing, what we don't want to do is simply pronounce that the client isn't ready. We need to meet them where they are with modifications and accommodations. Otherwise, the client's likely to die not ready, right? They're going to run out of life before they're ready. So we need to identify these difficulties wherever they are, whatever they are. The information that we're getting is going to be bright red neon signs pointing to how their nervous system is protecting them and how we might need to engage those protective parts in a way that is tolerable and in a way that is interactive and compassionate. And then we're going to engage them every session and between sessions until they're prepared enough, again, prepared enough to do trauma reprocessing. So thank y'all for joining. I kind of view this episode as a kind of broad overview of what I'm up to, what I've been up to, and let's stop trying to run people, particularly people with really, really complex trauma, people for whom mindfulness has never worked for them, through the same mindfulness machine. If we're working with a different, profoundly different nervous system, the way we approach that system has to be different. And again, I don't mean this to sound critical, but if clients continue to struggle, it may not just be because of their difficulties. It may be because we haven't learned ways to adapt what we need them to do into a way that they can digest and metabolize and that makes sense for them. And the last thing we want to do for a client with complex trauma is send the message that, once again, I think about this, the county fair, this line at the county fair, you have to be this tall in order to ride this ride. Our clients have always been here. We need to figure out what we do to let them ride this ride, because they're probably not going to get better. They're probably not going to get pervasively healthier until they can do some unburdening. And they can't do some unburdening until they can change their relationship slightly with the present, with the body, and with noticing, at least not in EMDR. So thank you for joining. Thank you for all the good work that you do in the world. Be in touch. Let me know if any of this was helpful. Let me know what you'd like to hear more about. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.